Jewish sociologist, Charles Moskowitz, to my show today. And today we are going to be exploring um, the sociology and the context of anti-Semitism, because as we are seeing a rise in anti-Semitism, and once again, the Jewish people are being scapegoated for what is a dynamic that has been maybe centuries, if not millennia, in the making, that traces all the way back to the Roman Empire, to the city of London. And there's a context for what is happening. So I think in order for us to kind of address the problems that are overtaking not only America, but the nations worldwide, we need to have clarity about the problem. And we also need to understand that the Jewish people were part of the great American experiment. They co-founded the United States as a country, a nation under God, with the original founders. And the subversion did not come from them, but it came from forces that have been operating throughout the world, that really, again, stem back to the city of London, within the Vatican and around the world. And I think we need to acquire that clarity. And so with us today, we have the brilliant researcher, writer, sociologist, Charles Moskowitz. And we are going to be discussing his latest book called The Anti-Semitic Imagination, The Great Establishment Deception. So welcome to the show, Charles.
Thank you very much, Susan. Pleasure to be here.
So pleasure to have you. Now, can you tell us a little bit about your background and why you decided to write this book at this time?
Well, I've been involved with Jewish affairs for many decades. I've been a radio host, former radio host, really, but recently doing somewhat of a comeback and a re-entry through doing an internet program, a live stream, a podcast. And I've written many books on a variety of topics, mostly social theory, at least my recent books. And I felt compelled to write this book because of what I see as a rise in anti-Semitism, not necessarily the overt, ugly kind of anti-Semitism, but just anti-Semitism in kind of a genuine and honest misunderstanding of the nature of what you're talking about here, which is this sort of international order, this what C. Wright Mills described as the power elite that I think has increasingly been consolidating control over the world. Sociologist and social theorist Francis Fukuyama wrote the book The End of Time, which was popular in the 2010s, where he notes that with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the contest between the two great superpowers and two super ideologies, you had the United States basically ruling the world. And to a certain extent, he is correct, except that we have to take a look at who's ruling the United States and the nature of that rule, which includes this sort of power elite that now has hegemony all over the world. And it's a very dangerous situation for average people under God. You know, we derive our sovereignty from the creator of the universe, not from the state. That's the American credo. And we're gradually seeing that erode and being transferred to this internationalist, illuminated superstate that is increasingly dangerous in that it has tools to control people through advanced studies in psychology and psychiatry, how to create group experience and group control, and also advanced technologies and use of media to informally develop a world control. And in my book, I get into that. The danger is that it's going to be viewed as the Jews. And what I would argue, and I do so in my book, is that that's a diversion, always has been. That's focusing on the shiny object, the Jew. Look at the Jew down the street. He's more successful than you are. You know, it's this anti-Semitic imagination, and that he did it by ripping you off somehow. That's the Marxist theory that Karl Marx developed in On the Jewish Question, that the Jew is exploiting you. And therefore you turn your attention to the Jew, and that's recently expanded into attention on Zionism, which is the national religious aspirations of the Jewish people, as a way to divert attention from the actual culprit, which is becoming more obvious every day. And that is this international order that is not Jewish, it's not Christian, it's actually, if you want to get down to it, somewhat pagan, and that we need to, in a sense, understand the nature of that apparatus in order to confront it, identify it, and be free of it, and not get distracted.
That's very true. Um, where would you like to start our discovery? And we can go back to the Roman Empire, on how we lost control and what the original religions, both Judaism and Christianity, espoused, or we can, approach the problem from a more modern standpoint.
Well,
Um,
we could go either way, Susan. I mean, your work tends to be looking at, I think, the more modern approach. You draw in some of the international banking institutions, particularly the Rothschild banking family, which I think is something that we probably should address, and how they consolidated power by controlling the nature of our currency and using that power to for both good and bad reasons. But the bad reasons is consolidation of wealth into their own hands. And I generally see the real, if we had to identify a defining moment when the world order really became predominant, um, because there've always been these competing establishments, and there've always been movements to aspire toward world control, going all the way back to Adam and Eve. I mean, this is sort of baked into power. It's a corruption of power, and I think that the founding fathers of this country, regardless of what their connections may have been, by the way, they nevertheless established a system by which we can counter that power through separation of powers into all these different silos, so the powers compete with each other. And they also codified the concept that comes from the Torah, which of course is part of Christianity as well, and that is that all power comes from the creator of the universe, not from the artificial state. And thus we have the power as images of God, not as God, but as imperfect images, to identify and to find the nature of our own lives and our own destinies, and to identify evil, and to identify attempts to corrupt our rights as sovereign citizens under God. But I think that the jumping off point, to get back to your question, was the Cecil Rhodes Roundtable
mhm,
establishment at the turn of the 19th, 20th centuries. Um, Obviously, as I say, there have been attempts to create world order from that time right up to that moment, from the beginning of time. But the Rhodes Roundtables were a coordinated, secretive group of societies that sought to merge the British Commonwealth nations and the United States into an Anglo American hegemony that would informally rule the world. Um, my source on this is Professor Carroll Quigley, the author of Tragedy and Hope.
mhm,
He was a professor at Georgetown University, Foreign Affairs, for many decades. He was the mentor to Bill Clinton and to many others. And he kind of blew the whistle on this. He was proud of it, and he thought it should be known in this book. And the Rhodes Roundtable basically spawned the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, Chatham House, or the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, which works closely with the City of London, as you say, which is a sovereign entity inside Great Britain, and other satellite offices around the world. And their theory was this informal rule of the world, not outright government where you had one great dictator come march in, but control over their societies all around the world through placing of their people in positions of power and influence, and through the use of their control of currency, through their private, quasi-private entities. In this country, it's the Federal Reserve System, that would be able to manipulate the value of money to their advantage, and would basically, in a social sense, informally enslave people to that value. And I think it's that point where, and this was the turn of the 20th century, where you saw the enthronement of this world order. Um, it was not particularly Jewish. It was around the same time that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was published, which I urge people to read. I have covered that heavily in my book because when you read it, you become pretty aware quickly, at least I did, that it has nothing whatsoever to do with Judaism or with Jews. It wasn't written by Jews. It to do to understand that. So
Yes, there's a little bit of you're frozen on my side, but
we
um,
seem to be having a little. Let me
there, I
just.
think we're. Um, are you there? You are.
We're
Um,
back.
you're back, and I think you make a very good point. You talked about a permanent administrative class that kind of governs the works behind the scenes from administration to administration, that answers to the City of London. How did this come about? This permanent administrative class, and what exactly is it? Who controls it?
Well, first of all, there's always been a governing class, and that's not necessarily a bad thing as long as we, in this country, the idea was to check its power through separation of powers, and so you can occasionally, cleanse it and move new people in so that you have limited powers. It in this country, it became a permanent. Um,
Big
what
shadow
what
governments.
Yeah, what Michael Glennon of Fletcher School calls a double government, what President Trump called the deep state, what Eisenhower called the military industrial complex. It's gone by different names. It was enthroned in this country in the election of 1912 and the administration of self-avowed socialist Woodrow Wilson, who immediately in that pivotal year of 1913 he signed the amendment allowing for direct taxation, which had never been in place before. That way, every individual is now taxed at the source of their income, and they have to submit documents proving the nature of their income and other personal matters. It instituted the Federal Reserve System, which the Constitution says Congress shall regulate the value of currency, not this quasi-public, quasi-private agency of bankers who then can manipulate the value of currency and loan the government money at interest by creating currency that we have to pay back. I mean, a large portion of our national debt is maintenance of the interest that we have to pay the Federal Reserve and their cotillion of bankers, both domestic and international. And there were other things. I mean, they got rid of the appointment of U.S. senators to the House by the states, which removed state power and nationalized the Senate, and even the Prohibition Act, which was the first attempt by the federal government to interfere in the personal health and business of the citizen by forbidding them to have
I
alcohol.
thought it was very. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you. I
No,
thought it was very interesting that you mentioned Woodrow Wilson and the Federal Reserve Act. I think in your book you had indicated that Wendell House was essentially Wilson's dictator, and
indeed.
what I had discovered about reading about the Federal Reserve Act, it was actually never passed. It was there were only two senators who sponsored it. One of whom was Nelson Aldrich. The other I can't remember, and it was brought before Congress during closed session during a Christmas recess, and then
Hmm.
Wilson signed off on it. So it never became law. And then Wendell Holmes, the following year, he announced to the nation that both houses, but there was never a House companion bill. Both houses had unanimously endorsed the act and was signed into law. So I guess it was never fully authenticated. And this is a kind of a legislation that has essentially enslaved the American people. So
I've heard that as well. I mean, it's an interesting study. I've also heard that the income tax amendment was never actually ratified, but these things were implemented and they are the law, and the Federal Reserve issues not federal dollars, but Federal Reserve notes, which are IOUs to these bankers. And it's something that, I mean, I wrote a book on this separately, The Art and Science of American Money, where I show how, going all the way back to the very beginning with Alexander Hamilton, this country has struggled with every administration to control our own currency.
Mhm.
And that the great battle with Andrew Jackson, we could take a look at history, how he got rid of the Second Bank of the United States, and he identified them as vipers. There was an attempted assassination against him. Lincoln issued greenbacks to pay for the Civil War rather than borrow money from the bankers, and he was assassinated. I get into that. It's a fascinating history. The fact is that, and Kennedy issued silver certificates, which were rescinded the day after he was assassinated. So this is a battle under the hood, as it were, that's been going on in American politics since day one. And what we have then is this control of our currency by this private cartel. Now, they blame the Jews again, and I get into
Yes, you
this in the
do.
anti Semitic imagination. Um, and a lot of that goes back in history. It goes back to the Middle Ages when the Jews were allowed to live in Europe because of St. Augustine, who issued a decree called the Sicut Judaeus in Latin. It was basically that at his time, there was a lot of Catholic and Christian leaders who wanted to annihilate the Jews and who wanted to forcibly convert them. And he said it's not necessary. The Jews should be allowed to worship God and practice his faith without any interruption, as long as they do not take positions of public import, as long as they don't, aren't in public influence because they were mistaken in that they did not believe in the divinity of Jesus as Christ. Therefore, they have to be punished, but they should be allowed to live. The fact is that the way this worked out was that the Jew was developed in Europe a separate administration, a separate judicial system, actually, and they would work in partnership with the European potentate, the king, the
Mhm.
duke, the prince, who the Jews would do things for the prince that the prince couldn't do himself because it was against Christianity and it was against Christian law. And the Jew was not allowed to be involved in various professions. They weren't allowed to own land. They weren't allowed to be involved in guilds. So they got involved in money lending and other certain functions that were at times unsavory and unpopular for the king and the prince. A good example is in Poland, the Jews were very involved in tax collecting and property management. So the aristocracy could then enjoy their wealth and not have to run the business. But when you had, it built up resentment, and then when Chamonix invaded and rebelled in Poland, the Jews were massacred because they were viewed as this enemy, this group that, was engaged, controlling everyone. But the fact of the matter is that it was a symbiotic relationship between the Jews and the Christian princes. It didn't one existed with the other. You can't blame the Jews for this. It was like they kind of it's a role that they were given and that they enjoyed for sure at times. And one of the motivations of the Jews, besides making a few bucks, no question, was that they were buying protection for their own community. They felt like we'll be protected by the Pope, which they were mostly, or by the prince. And of course, the downside to that was that when the prince died or when something bad happened, they would be sold out. All of a sudden the new guy would come in and he would exile the Jews and confiscate all their property, or they would, bad things would happen. So it was a very insecure system, one that the Rothschild family tried to overcome when Amstel Meyer Rothschild, who was sponsored by the Duke of Hesse in Frankfurt on Main, he sent his 5 sons out to all of the great European capitals to set up businesses, banking businesses, and to, basically develop a relationship with the local rulers, the kings. And they were extremely successful at it, with the idea being that, if you take one down, then they could switch it to the other, and that we can't just be all, exiled and we kind of have everything confiscated. They would communicate through diplomatic pouch. They were, their daughters and would marry into other banking families, so that they developed this whole sort of culture of banking. They did come to the United States, and they did a lot of good things in terms of like investing in infrastructure. They helped build the Erie Canal. They helped build the Aswan Dam. They helped, do great works. But there's a dark side. There's a side that they profited from war, and in that sense, they're demonic. Uh, it was not exclusively the Jews who were involved in this. You had the Knights Templar were the first world's bankers, actually, and that
Mhm.
was a Catholic order of monks. And the Venetians invented the check, and they invented insurance in their trade with the Islamic countries and with the East. And of course, Great Britain had the Barings, and Germany had the Fuggers, and there was in Scandinavia you had the Hanseatic League. So it was not unique to the Jews, but the Jews got the blame because, again, the shiny object. This is the Jews' fault, when in fact they could have been ripping off people, and there could have been big economic dislocation. And I think the Jews played that role then as well.
That's true. I think you spoke about the court Jew, and I think what we're looking at is really different rivalries for power. I think from the very beginning, Christianity was an outgrowth of Judaism, but what many people don't know is that it was also inspired by Buddhism. The sense of love thy neighbor as thyself, or redemption, compassion for other people, a strong sense of ethics. But I think it was shaped by Western civilization. And I think you have, on the one hand, you have the Catholics who were the Vatican, which was empowered in part by the Venetian merchants, who are very ruthless. They established mercenary armies that try to conquer Eastern Europe. And on the other hand, you had the Protestants, who were rivals to the Catholics, and each had their own kind of court Jew, and I think they were at odds with each other. And I think at some point, I know that you spoke of the Hanseatic League. The British monarchy created the East India Company for the merchants of London who were Jewish, because they took issue with the immorality of the Hanseatic League. And eventually, the East India Company was infiltrated by the merchants of Venice, who were, so you have this ruthless takeover. And with the Rothschilds, they eventually took over the British monarchy. I think that was through the Napoleonic Wars. And not only did they intermarry and interbreed with the royal families, but I think there was also an element of genocide, where they were genociding rival families. And so I think this kind of Rothschild dynamic is a reflection of the fact that it's like a combination of all these kind of negative influence from the Venetian merchants and these uh, Eastern European mercenaries who kind of infiltrated the West and are looking more towards establishing a monopoly on wealth and power with no regard to the Judeo-Christian principles. It's more of a power lust, if you will, and maybe that's how I see it.
Well, I mean, I think that, as we all examine this phenomena of this international order and how they function, it's a very complex subject. There are a lot of theories. There's truth to everything you're saying, Susan, but yet there's more to it if you open the lens. I would suggest, for example, that in Great Britain, things got underway when Henry VIII broke
True.
away from the Catholic Church, and the new Church of England confiscated and looted all of the Catholic wealth of
Mhm.
England, not just the churches, but the treasures, the money, and they handed it off to prominent British political families like the Rhodes. That's where Cecil Rhodes came from, like the Cecils. There's
Mhm.
all these British, kind of aristocrats who became the sort of the English establishment. I mean, their main patron saint of the 19th century would be Charles Darwin. And I mean, I get into that in my book. That's a whole big subject. But the point is that they're the ones who aspired to informally create this international empire through divide and conquer, and through basically merchandising and the seizing of raw materials, which would be brought back to England, manufacture, and then sold back. That's one of the reasons that one of the things that led to the American Revolution. And and it was kind of, I think, a phenomena that started from there. That's not to say the Rothschilds didn't have a big hand in it. They became very powerful in England, especially, and also in France and Italy and Vienna under each of the family members.
It was certainly a contributing factor to the American Revolution because I remember that uh, originally the colonies established their own currency, printed their own currency for commerce amongst themselves and also through with other nations. And once the city of London got wind of this, they outlawed any the rights of the colonies to print their own money, required them to only loan money or to acquire money through lending from the Bank of England, and that created debt. They were able to devalue the currency, which led to widespread unemployment. And in order to get out from underneath the thumb of the British Empire, the American Revolution was waged. So it's our efforts to
Oh,
establish
absolutely.
financial independence,
That's
from
right. Fascinating history. A major part of the American Revolution that is not at all discussed in the conventional history books. I mean, Benjamin Franklin actually was in England and he was asked by members of parliament about why America was so successful. And he said, because we have our own script. It started right here in
correct.
Massachusetts, my own home state, where they issued land bank currency based on, it was a quote, a technically a fiat currency. It wasn't based on gold. It was based upon the value of property, of farms, of production, and that they would get a small bit of interest on it to improve the infrastructure in the colony. And for example, in Boston, the uh, the street lights were all built from those funds. So, there was no need for taxation per se. A little bit of user tax for very specific services, but for the most part, the government was able to pay for its own function and have extra money to pay for these great infrastructure projects, which they were able to do interest free from the money. And that, yeah, the parliament came in and said, this, we can't let this happen. And they made the Bank of England, they gave it a monopoly, that being Paterson's Bank. And that the Bank of England then came in and it caused a depression for the first time. And that you could only pay your taxes in gold, which people didn't have. And one of the first acts of the Continental Congress, right after the Declaration of Independence, was to issue Continental scrip. So this has been a struggle in America from that day until today. Control over the national currency, and I mean, to go back to our topic, which is the anti-Semitic imagination. It's not a Jewish thing. Judaism is not does not condone usury, but at the same time, it doesn't condemn it. And usury requires laws to regulate it, but in and of itself, it's necessary for credit in order to project income and then invest into a prudent and conservative investment so that you can then create something. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it was corrupted by this sort of collusion between these private bankers and these princes who basically enriched themselves with easy money without raising taxes on their subjects, so they didn't, and nobody got angry, and then expanded their power into these world empires, which led to World War One.
And going back to like the anti-Semitic imagination, I think you said that the first sin that has been blamed on the Jews is the killing of Christ. But you said that might not have happened actually. And so if I could ask, what was the context of the crucifixion, and why did the Jews reject Christ? And what is the basis for like building the third temple, or what did they aspire to do instead? Like, why was he not accepted as their Messiah?
Yeah, thank you. No, I do get into this very controversial subject in my book, The Anti-Semitic Imagination. And what I would point out is that basically, if you look at the context of the times in which Jesus lived, and I do acknowledge that Jesus was, without question, the most important man, regardless of the question of divinity, to ever live, because he brought the entire Torah and all of the moral and ethical precepts to most of mankind, to really all of mankind. His ministry did, even though I think his ministry, from a Jewish standpoint, was a very Jewish ministry. It was meant for the Jews. The people around him, his disciples, were all Jews, and the whole affair was a Jewish affair. Now, why was he crucified? Um, I think it was because at that particular time, Judea was under the boot heels of Rome, which was a very brutal occupier. There was no freedom there. The Romans were crucifying people constantly outside of the gate of Jerusalem in what's called Calvary to scare people and to make examples. And you had people who claimed to be Messiah all the time who were being crucified. Um, Jesus was crucified ultimately by the Roman state in the person of Pontius Pilate. And Pontius
You
Pilate,
know,
yep.
sorry. I
Oh,
wasn't sure if you were aware of some alternative views in which it has been alleged that Jesus may not have been crucified after all. For example, in the Quran, the Muslims believe that it was his crucifixion was a political stunt. There are royal historians who believe that he was alleged to have been crucified in order to solidify his divinity, because in Buddhism, um, you are characterized as being godlike if you are able to die and then be born again. So they created this myth around alleged myth around Jesus at the Council of Nicaea to establish that he had a virgin birth like the Buddha, and that he had died and been born again. So it's possible that he may not have been, crucified after all. I mean, I'm not saying that he was or wasn't, but I'm saying there's an alternative history that may not have happened.
okay. I mean, I generally don't want to go into theological questions or
Okay,
questions
fair
of
enough.
Christology because it's not my
Mm.
area of expertise. I also don't really think that as a Jew, it's really my business to comment on Jesus' his status as God or as Son of God. That's a Christian question. But from a Jewish perspective, we do accept that he was crucified, as do Christians, and that the thing that I think inspires me about that crucifixion, and which has inspired all of mankind ever since, and which was mentioned by William Jennings Bryan in his closing argument trial, which is a speech that should be read. It's incredible. Is that Jesus was the first man to stand up as an individual and
Correct.
defy the earthly power of the world empire of his day, which was Rome. Rome at that time controlled the world. And Jesus said, when Pontius Pilate said, do you repent? Do you recant of your position as the king of the Jews? Who do you answer to? He asked him. And Jesus said, I answer to a higher authority than the Roman Empire. And right after saying that, within an hour of having said that, he was crucified. And that was the first time that the individual under God stood up and said, I answer to a higher authority. This is the same thing that was said by Mordecai in the book of Esther when Haman demanded that Mordecai bow to him. And he said, I only bow to God. I don't bow to men. I don't bow to the state. And that set off a whole trigger of events that is what Jews observe in the Purim holiday. So that is an inspiration.
And,
And it's something that has inspired freedom conscious people ever since that Jesus did this. He set in motion and this idea that the individual stands is answers to God and that we're created in the image of God and not ruled by the state.
and that became the basis of the common law, that your rights under God,
That's right.
essentially, like your
That's
God-given
natural
rights.
law. That's right. And as far as the crucifixion itself, look, I wasn't there, but I think that there was a great deal of fear among the Jewish community, particularly the Pharisees, who were the intellectuals of the community, that Jesus could lead to a complete total slaughter of Jews by the Romans. They felt that he could cause an insurrection, and that it would result in the destruction of the temple and the complete destruction of the Judean state. Eventually, that did happen anyway, probably about 30 or 40 years after Jesus' death. But I think that that was what was going on there. Plus, his claim that he was God, whether they were true or not, that is a heresy in Judaism to make that claim. And I think that Catholics need to realize that they've executed a lot of people who were heretic to them. I mean, this is how people acted. I mean, if you look at Jan Hus, for example, the Bohemian uh, movement, the Pope in Rome had him and 250 of his followers all burned at the stake because they were seen as defying the power of the Catholic Church. Now, I'm not going to judge that. I'm just noting it because this is what people do. I mean, back then, it's not something that it's obviously a terrible mistake to have done. They shouldn't have done it, but that's what I think the thinking was at the time.
And the Bible does specifically state that one of the commandments is thou shalt not kill. So that was, apostasy, that they did execute people for a difference of opinion, even though it was a challenge to their power. I don't know if you would feel comfortable talking about some of the controversial passages in the Talmud, like with the references to Jesus that you spoke of in your book,
Yes.
about the context of why, because I
No,
know that's often
well,
referenced as a basis for anti-Semitism.
that Jesus is burning in human excrement and that kind of stuff. No, I mean that it first of all, it's not definitely about Jesus. That's something that we can't know. Rabbis have said that this was put in by Onkelos, who was one of the great Talmudists of the time, but who also was Roman in background, and he had been a Roman pagan priest before he converted to Judaism, and that he was writing about situations that existed when he was a pagan. And when he talked about, he also talked about Titus burning in excrement and other figures. And so we don't know if it was about Jesus, but it may have been about Jesus. I will only say about that the Pope in Rome was recognized by the rabbis of Europe and of Christendom as the supreme religious power. They honored and understood that. And the Pope in Rome, when these passages were brought to his attention by Nicholas Donin, who was a Jewish heretic, by the way, he wrote to the rabbis and said, remove this material at once. And they did. So it's not in the Talmud, hasn't been in the Talmud for over a millennia. We're talking about like 8th century, 9th century, 10th century, maybe, when this happened. And when the Pope basically assigned Louis IX of France the job of destroying Talmuds, which he did. He burned 13 crates of Talmuds on the grounds of the Chateau de Ville, which is still there, along the Seine. So, yeah, this was a controversy.
Are there
There
some?
was, yeah. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I'm sorry. You cut off for a minute. There are some passages in the Talmud. I'm not a Talmudic scholar, but there are some passages that appear to establish one law for in which Jews are to engage with each other, and another law for how they are to engage with others outside the group, which may not be as favorable.
Right.
Do Jews? Can you provide context to some of that? To what is meant?
Sure. I mean, I think that generally, and again, I'm not a Talmudic scholar either. I've only begun to study the Talmud, and it's something that at my age, at this stage of my life, I don't have any patience for. I mean, as much as I respect it and I revere people who do study it, it's a very, very intricate study where you can spend a year talking about whether or not a pin is the right shape, if the angels were on this side or that side, and it's excruciating, but it's important, and it's in a sense the basis of a lot of Jewish skills, especially in the area of law. But and by the way, a lot of Catholic law schools now have Talmudic studies for that reason. But the Talmud is something that was developed by Judah the Prince, Yehuda Hanazi, around the time of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, because they were friends and they collaborated with each other. And Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, wrote a book called Reflections, which is still available today. Great thinker. And basically, what he did was he codified what was called the oral law. The oral law, according to rabbinic tradition, was given by God at Sinai along with the written law, which is the Torah, but it was passed on from generation to generation. A lot of people, indigenous people around the world, have oral law. That's not unique to Judaism. But Yehuda Hanazi said we have to codify this because this was after the destruction of the temple. It was after the Bar Kokhba revolt had been crushed. Judea had been renamed Palestine by the Romans to mock Jews by naming it after their worst enemy, the Philistines, and to basically, this was done by Hadrian, basically to declare Judaism as ended. And so they said, in order for us to survive and in order for us to continue the covenant, we're going to have to write down the oral law. So they began to codify the Talmud. And the Talmud is partially the reason it existed was to keep Judaism as a separate nation living in the house of others as a minority, to maintain the Jewish identity, maintain a system of worship, to maintain the covenant. But part of the ability to do that was to keep Jews separate, not necessarily better than anyone else, but separate. Jews were not allowed to go to these big Roman banquets and drink Roman wine, for example. They could only drink wine blessed by a rabbi because they wanted to keep the Jews from going to those banquets, partially because a lot of corrupt stuff was going on at them, but also to maintain a sort of a separate code of ethics, to maintain a separate system that's more consistent with Sinai. And so as a result, you have a separation. There is people, I think, who are not Jewish see that as somehow, that Jews think they're superior. I don't think so. I've heard a lot of talk recently from people about Jewish supremacy. My thoughts on that is perhaps, but not in the same way that like a Nazi supremacy, that we're better than someone else ethnically or racially. It's maybe more to do with the belief, however misguided, I may add, that we have taken on a little bit of an extra layer of moral code, of ethics, of love, of compassion for our families, of education, and of human value, and which separates us, and I suppose, and some people think, makes us better, but not because we're intrinsically better. It's not like a Nazi kind of a thing with a DNA. It has more to do with a cultural sense.
You spoke of a tikkun olam, where the Jews are called to be a light unto the nations and to kind of restore God's creation. And you've said that the concept has been misappropriated by the left.
Indeed.
And it's being used.
Yeah, to repair the world by observing the Torah and by worshiping God. The whole concept of the chosen people is not because we're chosen to rule over anyone else, not because we're chosen to control others in the secular plane, but because we're chosen to worship God. We're chosen to know God and to take on an extra layer of responsibility, which can be burdensome, I might add, in order to be closer to God, in order to make ourselves holier. And thus, by doing so, which we have not succeeded at, to an extent we have at times, but by doing so, or by striving to do to all the nations, so that they can also know God, and that is to God, and bring about, God willing, the era of the Messiah.
Um, some of the more modern movements like communism have been blamed on Jews, and I know from my own studies that communism was really an outgrowth of the rational Enlightenment, which rejected God, and it was really based upon Asian logic and other philosophies and influences that had nothing to do with either Judaism or Christianity. And that the Bolsheviks were in fact, they were not indigenous to Russia. These were kind of immigrants who came into Russia from Asia, who maybe identified as Jews or infiltrated Jewish communities. Could you talk about, I know you referenced this in your book, Jews are often blamed for communism and for these different movements that are subverting societies. Can you identify or explain, I guess, what is the basis of Judaism? How is it not really an expression of Judaism? And how did this movement come about, in your opinion?
The idea that Judaism is subverting society, that does come from a very specific Orthodox strain of Christian thinking, one that's expressed today by Dr. E. Michael Jones, who's been a guest on my program many times. That is that because we're responsible for killing God, and we knew that it was God, we are therefore subverting mankind. We're subverting all society. Um, we exist irregardless of what our relationship was with Jesus or with anyone else. Our covenant goes back to Sinai. We are not subverting anyone. We've been subverted by some of the same forces that have
Correct.
subverted Christianity, those being satanic movements, and I get into that in my book. As far as the Bolshevik movement is concerned, it goes, I mean, there's always been a collectivist movement, and it's always been a con job. But the modern movement goes back to the French Revolution, where the word communism was first used by Gratius Babeuf, who was a member of the Jacobin Secret Society that launched the French Revolution. A very interesting book on this whole subject, which traces the subversive movement from the French Revolution to the Bolshevik coup, was written by James H. Billington. He's a former Librarian of Congress. The book is called Fire in the Minds of Men. Excellent read, brilliant scholar, one of America's most respected, certainly an establishment figure, by the way, very much like Dr. Carol Quigley, one of these whistleblowers, perhaps inadvertently. And the Bolshevik movement itself, I think it had influence from maybe from Eastern sources, but also from Marx, who I think was probably an employee of the Illuminati. I get into that in my book. That's speculation. I can't prove it. But, he set off the Communist Manifesto, which lays out the planks of that movement. Um, and that the movement was basically, made up of disaffected Russian aristocrats and people like Bakunin, who actually were anti-Semites, putting that aside. But the Jews flocked to that movement in the late part of the 19th century for a lot of reasons, some good, some bad. And the Jews were at the forefront of the Bolshevik movement. They held some of the worst positions in it, in a way similar to the relationship between the Jew and the European prince. The Jews would be brought into, and they'd be allowed to do certain things that were not good and not savory, but were highly visible, and they'd be rewarded for it, but they would develop hatreds as a result. And so, yeah, the world could point to the number of Jews who embraced Bolshevism and say, look, it's a Jewish thing. Now, I would argue that this is a dark stain on Jewish history, something that we need to come and reckon with, and something that we have not reckoned with, because there are still to this day Jews who are continue to believe that there was something virtuous in the Bolshevik and communist movements. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
oh, yeah, sorry. Yes, I think the Russian Revolution led to like the deaths of tens of millions, and Chinese Revolution, tens of millions of innocent people. And I know that these were bankrolled by Wall Street, by J.P. Morgan. The descendants of the East India Company were heavily involved with them, and I believe that the movements were also planned and coordinated out of the city of London too. So you're looking at the same kind of agenda. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Woodrow Wilson might have provided the visas for Lenin or Marx, I think, to travel
Trotsky.
into. It was Trotsky. That's what
Yeah.
that's who it was.
Mm-hmm.
To travel into to travel back to Europe. Oh, you're right, because
With
that was Russian
suitcases
Revolution.
full of cash. That's right.
That's
And
correct.
some of the money came from Jewish bankers like Jacob Schiff. Oh yeah, no, there's no question about it. It is a nasty piece of history that should be reckoned with. You did have some Jews who really did not like Tsar Nicholas II, and that they wanted to help a movement to overthrow him. It was also part of it was to get Russia out of the war in World War One, because one of the first things Lenin did was sign the Brest-Litovsk treaty that ended the Eastern Front. And then the United States jumped into the war. There was a lot going on with that, but yeah, there were definitely financiers. A good source on that I forget his name, Wall Street and the Bolsheviks, Sutton, Anthony Sutton, a fellow at the at the Stanford Institute who wrote two books that are very good: Wall Street and the Bolsheviks and Wall Street and Hitler.
I read both of them, and I agree they're excellent sources.
Yeah.
And I think the Jews were told that massacring the Tsar and the Bolshevik Revolution was a good thing because the Tsar had presided over pogroms. I don't know if he actually did or not, but that's how the Jewish community was brought on board. And I think
Yeah.
weren't there Jews working on both sides? Like I think Chaim Weizmann, who helped found the modern Zionist movement, weren't his siblings involved? Some were involved with the Nazis, and they were also involved with working with Stalin to propel the doctors' plot, which was intended to blame the Jews for having doctors kill their Jewish doctors kill their patients, to provide a pretext for anti-Semitism. Like to have them blamed for
I
what
don't
this was.
I don't know enough about that, but I do know that there were Jews on both sides of the Bolshevik Revolution. There were, nationalist Jews. There were communist Jews. As far as Jews involved with Nazism, not so much. I mean, first of all, the Nazis, to their own discredit, anti-Semitism was one of the major planks of their platform. I mean, they believed that the Jewish conspiracy was, to control the world, and that they viewed themselves as the rivals to that. Their anti-Semitism was both political and very much derived from Marx's on the Jewish question, but also it was racial. And they believed that as a race, the Jewish people threatened Germany. So you had a very toxic admixture of crackpot beliefs to make up the Nazi, idea in terms of that.
Yeah, I see both Hitler and Stalin as being different faces on the same beast. I understand that Hitler and Stalin were both trained at the Tavistock Institute at the City of London, and then they were installed as part of a divide and conquer, like for these international bankers to kind of carve up Europe, pit the nations against each other, and possibly also have a pretext to establish Israel. And I know that the Jews were promised a state of their own, but the manner in which they went about it, I think, was a little bit maybe not very ethical necessarily. Through the
Well, first
wars
of
and
all, I
genocide.
don't have any information about whether Hitler and Stalin were trained at the Tavistock Institute, but I will say that the Tavistock Institute is a very sinister topic and one that ought to be studied. I think they had a lot to do with the birth of the so-called counterculture in the 1960s. And I think that Hitler and Stalin, communism and Nazism are basically very similar. They are, in a sense, the flip side of the same coin. I agree with you on that. Billington wrote about this in that he said that out of the fever swamps of the French Revolution emerged the French slogan fraternity, liberty, and what is the third word?
Equality.
Equality, yes. And he points out that equality would come to mean communism, fraternity would come to mean Nazism, and liberty was the United States. So he saw these three principles as at war with each other, but balancing each other. But the point I'm making here is that the progression of the Nazi movement. I mean, it was very much a socialistic movement. And if you look at the Nazi, I mean, Hitler was probably a communist when he was, a street urchin in Vienna living off of his father's trust fund. And that basically, if you look at the 24 planks of the Nazi movement, it's very socialistic, it's very communistic. They emulated the Bolsheviks when they set up concentration camps, figuring that they'd get the same great treatment that the Bolsheviks had gotten by the world establishment when they were trumpeted as a great progressive movement of world history as they were slaughtering millions of people. They figured they'd get that same pass because they also were part of this great social transformation, and that literally they imitated a lot of the Bolshevik tactics. I mean, the Bolsheviks set up the first national police agency, the Cheka, which the Nazis modeled the Gestapo after that, having a national police as opposed to in the United States where we have local police. We've been moving in that direction, but that's another subject. Um, there's a lot of parallels, a lot of similarities to that. Now, the second part of your question was about Zionism. Zionism is I get into a chapter in my book on Zionism. It is simply the national aspirations of the Jewish people, nothing more and nothing less. It is both a nationalist and a religious movement that's taken on different forms each century from the time of the destruction of the Second Temple right up to the 1948 Declaration of Independence. There has not been a century that's gone by. We have not had a Zionist movement. There are things about it that we don't know about, which are actually pretty substantial in terms of the Jewish people attempt to reestablish their homeland in the land that God commanded us to take possession of. That tiny little swath of territory that exists between the river and the sea. There's nothing more to it. It's not an attempt to conquer the world. It is simply an attempt. God commanded Abraham to take possession of that land so that we could create a commonwealth that would rise a level of spirituality for the rest of the world, but we would be able to practice our faith in freedom as a sovereign people. That's what Zionism is. That's what Zionism has always been. Now, do the modern Zionists sometimes engage in world order tactics and unsavory tactics to preserve that land and to advance that simple goal? Yeah, they do. There are some pretty unpleasant elements to Israeli history, but I would only point out that the difference between the Zionist aspect of that history and the history of the Anglo-American establishment or the occult or any of these other movements is that the Zionist goal is very simple. That is the safety and the security of that tiny speck of land that is surrounded by genocidal forces and that is despised by the international establishment.
I remember that during the original founding of the Israeli state, that many of the most renowned Jews in America signed a letter which was submitted and published in the New York Times, which they opposed Zionism, and they said it would not be in the interest of Jews to create an Israeli state. Do you know the basis of that and why they were so opposed to Zionism?
Oh, the entire establishment was opposed to Zionism. I mean, the Council on Foreign Relations, the all of the powers that be. I mean, Truman was surrounded by people. I mean, Secretary of State George Marshall, certainly the Soviets, and the communist operatives in the American government. Secretary of Defense James Forrestal. They all were telling Truman, "Do not support Israel. Do not recognize it. They've got nothing. They've got no money. They've got no oil. They've got no land. They've got no population." Whereas the Arab countries and the Islamic countries have vast resources. You know, if you look at it just from a business standpoint and from a geopolitical standpoint, recognizing Israel
They're talking about
made no sense.
And so you're
It was
talking
not,
about like antagonizing billions of people you said who had oil and natural
yeah,
resources
that's
in
right.
order
And
to.
it was not in America's interest. Financially, it really wasn't. And yet Truman went ahead and did it. Now, some people have told me, well, he was bribed. Fine, maybe. But the point is, however it came about, he did it, and he did it against the advice of everyone around him. And I think that ultimately he did it because, besides those possibilities, the American people supported it, both liberal and conservative, left and right. American people supported the right of the Jewish people to have sovereignty in that tiny piece of land because it was reasonable. Most of the Arab establishment supported Israel, at least in the period right after World War One. I get into this when I talk about Emir Faisal bin Hussein, the head of the Arab world at the time, direct descendant from the Prophet Muhammad. He recognized Israel when he signed the Faisal-Weizmann Accords, which was part of the Paris Peace Conference that ended World War One, where he said, "We welcome back our brethren, our Jewish brethren, to their ancient land." His only basic caveat was that as long as the non-Jewish Arab population had basic rights, and as long as the Islamic places of worship were to be respected and left in the hands of Islamic authorities. Something that Israel has done, not perfectly, but they've tried to do it, and I think that they've gone to great measures to do that. The reason Faisal wanted to recognize Israel was very practical. After World War One, he wanted the Arab nations to obtain sovereignty and to become successful independent states. And he saw the Jewish state of Palestine as a partner in that endeavor because the Jews had modern technologies, they had democracy, they had ability, they knew how to get things done, they knew how to create a modern state. And he wanted them to help the Arab states do the same thing. And they still can. You know, the Arab street needs to wake up and realize that they're corrupt, rotten governments and oligarchies who are very much a part of this world order are selling them a bill of goods. They should look to Israel as an example of a successful sovereign society, as an organic, dynamic nation that puts its own people first, including non Jewish uh, citizens. And they should try to emulate that and do the same. So I think that this is, again, the use of anti Semitism as the shiny object. Pay attention, look over here, don't look at what we're doing. It's like a big game of three card Monte.
I think a lot of Americans are concerned with the amount of money that we're giving Israel, especially at a time of growing debt, and that Israel somehow has like an overwhelming influence on our government more than any other nation in the world. And I think that a number of politicians have reported maybe feeling coerced, like they have to support Israel even though they may not necessarily be aligned with its objectives. So I don't know if you'd want to address that or some of the reservations of Americans. I'm not saying I espouse them or not, but just some of the reservations of Americans.
Well, I think the reason Israel has that kind of influence in America is because Israel is supported by the most average Americans, and
Mm-hmm.
most average Americans vote. Most
Mm-hmm.
average Americans tell their congressmen to support Israel. That might be changing a little bit, unfortunately, but for the most part, that does remain the standard, except if you go to the far left and the far right fringes, Israel is supported, and the American people want to support Israel. And the reason why the internationalists and the left hate Israel, I would suggest there are two reasons. Firstly, because Israel is capitalist. It
Mm-hmm.
is it has a it's startup nation. It's a place where people can innovate and create new ideas, new industries. And secondly, because Israel is Jewish. Regardless of whether or not the average Israeli is religious, Israel is a fulfillment of the Torah, and that threatens the whole rotten, secular, illuminated establishment.
I hope you're right. I'm not necessarily convinced that Israel is independent of the corrupt establishment. If I know that Kissinger, who's the great establishment catalyst throughout from the Nixon administration onward, helped facilitate international scientific networks from the U.S. to Israel, and then Israel in turn extended those on to China, which is one of our strategic adversaries, and has also done so with Russia and the former Soviet Union. And I think those actions have put the United States at a bit of a disadvantage. So there's a sense that Israel has kind of undermined national security. And I don't blame that on Judaism. I blame that on kind of like the shadow governments that are the transnational networks that are kind of undermining all of the nations worldwide just to amass wealth for themselves. But I think those are some of the concerns.
Well,
That
I think that Israel has always part of the Israel has its own deep state, like
Mhm.
the United States does, and it's always been a player on the international order stage.
Mhm.
Again, I mean, some of the things they've done have been pretty bad, but the motivation at the end of the day is preservation of the tiny sovereign state of Israel. Israel has its own foreign policy, and that has at times meant playing footsie with the communist Chinese and with the Soviet Union. It's not the United States. It has its own agenda. It tries to balance a lot of things, and sometimes very, very poorly, and in a way that doesn't even work in any way in their own interests. I would just give one example of that, and that is that after the PLO, which had been trained, financed, and armed by the Soviet Union, after they were defeated in Beirut, and Arafat and his bloody handed thugs were forced into exile in Tunis, Yitzhak Rabin, invited them back to come into Israel and set up the Palestinian Authority. And that led to the Intifada. Now, why Rabin did this, of course, will never be known because he was assassinated shortly afterwards. But it basically
So
it didn't make any sense. I mean, it would have been a better idea to help foster local Arab government, get local Arab election, people that might have been more willing to coexist peacefully with Israel, as opposed to this group that sought to destroy Israel. Anyway, so those are terrible decisions that the Israelis have made. I could mention others. I'm very critical of things that Israel's done in the past and still does.
I see Israel, maybe rightly or wrongly, but as an extension of the British Empire, or this kind of Anglo-Saxon. Uh, it's like an agent of Anglo-Saxon imperialistic conquest, and that they are maybe using the United States to help them fight proxy wars in the interest of the Shadow League to help them acquire, natural resources, a monopoly on wealth, power, and commercial opportunities. So, and I don't blame that on Judaism, but I think maybe the Israeli state has been used to that end, and that the powers that be might have in turn, used our establishment and the wealth of America to that end.
I think there's some truth to that. I mean, the Israelis have played, in terms of the state, not the Israeli people and the Israeli society, but the sort of the shadowy part of the Israeli establishment has played a double game with the same shadow establishment that does exist in the United States, um, and they have engaged in aiding proxy wars. I don't think Israel has territorial ambitions beyond its borders. I don't think that they're seeking to conquer Jordan or Syria or any of their neighbors. I think they like to develop a peaceful relationship with their neighbors, and they hold out an olive branch of peace to them. So I don't think it's a matter of that. I think it's a matter of Israel sometimes trying to play its enemies off against each other with the theory that they'll, and that is a British idea, with the theory that they will somehow be left in a more peaceful condition and they won't have one solid enemy that they would have to confront. That's something that might be have some wisdom to it, but it can backfire, as we saw with recently with Hamas, which Israel supported in its early stages because they figured they would counter the influence of Arafat. It didn't work out well. So I mean, when they start to engage in this kind of geopolitics, things can backfire. They backfired on the United States with our support for the Mujahideen, which eventually morphed into Al Qaeda. So there are consequences to this kind of amoral realpolitik, and one of the biggest practitioners of that in the 20th century was Henry Kissinger.
No, that's for sure. I guess as we wrap up, what is the what are the plans for Israel, or I guess the Jewish people, for a third temple? What is it meant to achieve? And and I guess what kind of what would you tell your fellow Jews? I know, as a Christian, I would want to remind them that I know our institutions have been corrupted. We have the prosperity gospel. We have many expressions of Christianity that have been institutionalized, but have also been corrupted and rotted from within. And I've been very critical of that. I am a Christian, and I know that all of the establishment religions have been corrupted by the same kind of corrosive force. So I would wonder also what you would want to tell the Jewish people about restoring themselves to that faith, and what do you think the audience should know about Judaism, that in areas where they have misconceptions, where they tend to kind of view the Jewish person as the other, and they're not really seeing you in the correct way, if you will.
Well, as I started, I mean, Zionism is both a political and a religious movement,
Mhm.
and so I'll address the religious side of it. The first stage was 1948,
Mhm.
when David Ben Gurion declared independence of the Jewish state. The second stage was in 1967, when, after Israel was invaded by Jordan, they counter-invaded and they took possession of Jerusalem and the site of the temple and the wall. And I suppose, religiously speaking, the third stage will be the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. I don't think that Israel's ready for that. I don't think that they have reached a spiritual level for that. I think that ultimately, if that is to be done, and that could take another 1,000 years before it's done, it is going to have to be done in conjunction with the Muslim world. Together, there has to be a Jewish slash Muslim building of the third temple. The Jews can't do it alone. They didn't do it alone in the first temple. They did it in conjunction with the Sidonians, which are known in history as the Phoenicians. You can look at the Book of Kings to learn about that, which is an interesting history. They didn't do the second temple alone either. They did it in conjunction with Cyrus of Persia, who is the precursor to Iran. So the third temple as
Why is
well.
the temple so controversial? Oh. You're breaking up a little bit.
Because there are hotheads in Israel who want to do it now, and I don't believe they're right. You know, they're in a big hurry to do it and to replace the Dome of the Rock. It's a terrible mistake, and that would trigger world war. And I think that most Israelis are not part of that. It's not wise at this time. It tends to reek of kind of like a secular, movement that requires man pushing the hand of God. I think that this is something that's in the hands of God. We have to contemplate and pray and improve ourselves spiritually so that we're ready to know how to proceed, not rush into something like that. I hope it happens. I pray it happens, but it has to be done carefully and again in conjunction with the Arab nations. That's my opinion on that.
I think that it's very wise, and I think just kind of to reiterate, the basis for this show too, is that Jews and Christians should, in my view, and I believe that you also share this view, that we should come back to the foundations of our faith and realize our shared humanity, and that we shouldn't be fighting with each other, but we should be united in our shared humanity against this external force that you've described, so that we can sufficiently overcome the force and restore the world to God, within God's image, within
Hallelujah.
the biblical
Yeah.
principles.
And to find ourselves as citizens and as people under God. Susan, if you don't mind, since we're toward the end, I hope you don't mind if I get in a quick shameless
No,
plug
please
here
go ahead. Go
for
ahead.
my book, which is The Anti-Semitic Imagination, The Great Establishment Deception. It's available at Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble.
And do you have any social media or websites you'd like to share? I was going to get to this.
CharlesMoscowitz.com. You can look at my book page. I'm the author of over 20 books on Amazon. And I also do a broadcast on Rumble.
I have read your latest book, and I said it's very beautifully written. It's well written, historically accurate. I would recommend it. So absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I hope we can speak again sometime.
Thank you, Susan. I really have enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Be
Thank
well.
you.
Thank you.